In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the effect of crime on the political system, specifically. We talked about the effect that crime has on a variety of social systems, and also how their sort of level within the hierarchy with respect to the economy also affects their place in American society. Um, so what we're sort of looking at in terms of the level of crime right now, crime rates have been going down. We talked about that before. Crime rates are going down with the exception of drug crime. At the same time, criminal justice spending has been steadily increasing. It's been increasing since before we started the war on drugs, but really a lot since then. Also, criminal justice usage has increased in terms of SWAT raids, the things that we rely on the police to do, those things have all increased. So the question that we're looking at is why the persistence of this get tough philosophy when that's not really what's needed or what's even equitable with what's going on. The reason is because the issue has been reframed in the political system, in the political arena, and what it means to be seen as tough on crime versus soft on crime. So some of the things they look at, theories that have addressed some of these issues, labeling theory and conflict theory. Labeling theory basically meaning that people sort of adjust their behavior to the labels that society places on them. And then conflict theory we talked about before, where it's people in power imposing sanctions on the people that do not have that power. They focus on the criminal justice system as opposed to focusing on individual crime. Look at the system's impacts on crime. They look at the making of the policies and laws, focus on the enforcement of the laws, how they're enforced, who they're enforced on. Okay. You also have this idea of social constructionism, basically how these issues manifest themselves in reality. So how they're defined, and then eventually how they play out. Um, as they become part of society, we start to develop patterns of behavior, patterns of speech around those things. The best example of this, sort of outside of a criminal justice realm, is looking at the developing lexicon or sort of word usage, new words developing around social media and the proliferation of the internet. Before a couple years ago, TikTok was in reference to the movement of a clock. It didn't have anything to do with an app. Words like Twitter, Google, even the concept of Facebook. 20 years ago, a lot of those things were fairly inconceivable to most people, but now because they've been part of our lives, they have meaning. It's the same thing with crime, with laws, the way that we define things, the way that we talk about things. Um, the longer they stick around, the more impactful they are, the more people focus on them, the more meaning that they sort of develop. And one of the key things to focus on here on this side in particular, in the end, pundits and cultural media generally have more influence than science. And we've seen that a lot lately with the spread of misinformation with regards to protests, with regards to the global pandemic. Um, a lot of people are very willing to believe anything that they hear or that they read. Facebook is not a news source. With respect to Facebook and those other things, I think I've said it before in this class, I refer to the philosopher Marvin Gaye, who said, believe half of what you see and none of what you hear. So it's kind of an interesting time right now where we're seeing the sort of stock that people put in sources that maybe are not most trustworthy. So we've seen it sort of evolve, sort of what we're talking about with the crime debate. It's not originally it was sort of a liberal versus conservative agenda, but now a lot of people push the same thing. Although there's been some change in the last few years. More change in the last year probably than in the last 5 years. But there's a lot of agreement about how and why crime is bad, and it's still very tough to be elected, to be politically viable if you're seen as being soft on crime. But a lot of these sort of oversimplification things that we have here listed on the slide are not really the case of what's actually causing it. Again, these are sort of those sort of magic bullet proposals that don't really have much applicability. We see a lot of that, a lot of the original argument develop in the 1960s, where the law and order idea, the issue of crime, was really bootstrapped onto the civil rights era. A lot of people wanted to make the people that were protesting at that time, much like what happened recently, seem like they were criminals. They wanted to frame the protesters as people that were not following the laws, and thus subjected to the criminal justice system. When we move into the mid-1960s, there are some other issues starting to creep up. Again, the civil rights movement is really getting some strength, which upset a lot of people in the country because they wanted to maintain the old sort of status quo, but that's not what was happening. So that movement was really attacked through a labeling theory type of policy, where the protesters were labeled as criminals, and so they had fire hoses turned on them. They had the police dogs sicked on them, and then that affects the way people perceive those protests, people that aren't actually on the ground there with them. We also see the developing war in Vietnam happen at this point, so people's attentions are being pulled in a lot of directions. Unfortunately, because of the attacks, it really hindered President Johnson's ability to do some of the social welfare things that he was trying to do. And basically, this is really kind of the first time that a more liberal politician had to embrace a tough on crime mentality to maintain his position as the president. Again, the idea that he was trying to address was basically trying to affect issues of poverty, but that again was attacked and sort of reframed as issues of crime, that the people that were trying to pull up out of poverty are criminals and thus not really deserving of the benefits the government might be giving them. So again, a lot of the same arguments that we're hearing and seeing now are showing up here, and one of the ones that's sort of has a lot of racial tendrils coming out of it is the idea of why are these protesters burning their own neighborhoods. And it was mentioned in the first video that I put up from last week tonight. People are assuming that the people in these neighborhoods own that area, and a lot of times they don't. So they don't own the neighborhoods. They live there, but they have no permanent stake there. If they did own property, they might have a different response to what's happening. But that's, again, an assumption a lot of people are making. Why are people burning their own neighborhoods? They're not theirs, which is part of the problem. Having blocked access for minorities to things like the GI Bill, or to even to public housing when that was first created, and then blocked access to loans, where their mortgage companies basically drew lines on cities and said, we're not going to loan people, we're not going to make or give people loans in these areas. That targeted the people that wanted to live in those areas and also kept those areas particularly impoverished. So again, we see some of the political maneuvering start to sort of heat up in the back half of the 1960s, and it really hinged on trying to see which side the Southern Democrats were going to side with. The Democratic Party of the time in the South is more akin to the Republican Party now. Um, there's a lot of saying about a lot of the people that mix up a timeline want to say that uh, the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln that freed the slaves, and that the Democratic Party is the party that started the KKK. And in a strict um, sense of those were the labels that those parties used at the time, that's not really the parties that exist today. The parties that we see today as Republican and Democrat have basically flipped really a couple times throughout the course of American history in terms of what the driving ideology is. So it's very important to note that. And again, this time where the Republican Party and also the Democratic Party was trying to um, land the Southern Democrats, which was the major party at the time. Um, and so they both sides tried to um, incorporate elements that those individuals wanted in their platform. And the election of 1968 is very interesting because it was one of the last elections where you had members of the Democratic Party, particularly, where you had a candidate in the North and a candidate in the South that had very different ideologies in terms of viable candidates deep into the primary system. Um, Eventually, Robert Kennedy won the nomination in 1968 over um, George Wallace, the governor of Alabama. Unfortunately, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in between receiving the nomination and the election, and the Democratic Party had to basically scramble and put Hubert Humphrey, and he basically had no chance. He had no chance of winning coming in that late in the race. And that's what led to President Nixon's election and his sort of hard line stance on law and order that um, brought a lot of those Southern Democrats back into the fold. So the one of the major issues that came up during President Nixon's term is again one of those ideological shifts. The point of one of the principles that's supposed to be of the Republican Party is to have the minimal federal government. Um, at the same time, Nixon wanted to expand federal law enforcement, so he had a sort of a quandary of what he was going to do, um, and he decided that it was more important to have an increased federal law enforcement presence than it was to maintain those ideological principles of the Republican Party and trying to keep the federal government as small as possible. So during his administration, we see spending for the law enforcement assistance funds from the federal government going up from 75 million to 500 million. He picked and chose the research that he wanted to base his decisions on. Um, Bringing old studies that link things like race and class to crime into the forefront, and again relying on those sort of outdated um, and a lot of the research was based on inconsistent, inappropriate methods to make his point. Again, similar to what's happening now, where just because someone says it in a news broadcast doesn't mean that it has any validity. It's a similar thing with even printing academic sources. Not just because it's printed in an academic journal doesn't mean it's a good academic journal. Also, creating more others. So during his time in office, we see a lot of the push behind the civil rights movement begin to fade as some changes are made, some concessions are made, not nearly enough as we've seen, recently, or really all the entire time since then. There hasn't been any measure of equality. So we created sort of another other, continuing to blame the younger people with limited political agency, blame a lot of the troubles of the country on them at the time. We also see the Supreme Court switch from the due process model to the crime control model. Things like the RICO Act, the Omnibus Crime Bill, 1968, further cementing the law and order mentality, increasing sanctions, increasing punishments, increasing the authority of law enforcement. And that's where it stood for the majority of the 1970s. After Nixon was left office, you could say he resigned, but he was basically forced out the back door. And then during Carter's administration, there were other geopolitical things that came up that took people's attention. The gas crisis. Later in Carter's presidency, the Iran the Iran hostage situation. So crime really wasn't a major focus for the American public at that time. We see that again change during the Reagan and Bush years, where we see a lot of the war on drugs heat up. The Just Say No campaigns, increases in punishments, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes and you're out. And all of these things came at the expense of social welfare systems. Because when you put money into one element of public works, you have to take it from somewhere else. As you see here in this graph, as the criminal justice spending goes up, cash assistance for welfare programs go down. And it's a very clear chart. One's very clearly affecting the other. And throughout this time period, from the end of Nixon's term through the end of President Clinton's term, it's a pretty clear divergence with criminal justice spending going up and cash assistance programs going down. Again, another one of the common things that people complain about cash assistance programs or other sorts of social welfare programs, that people are going to exploit them. Yeah, that's going to happen. If you make rules, people are going to figure out ways to get around them. The New England Patriot model of if you're not cheating, you're not trying applies just about everything in life. The two arguments against that are, one, just because some people are cheating doesn't mean you're not helping a lot of other people. And two, when people do cheat, it gives us an opportunity to catch them and then adjust the program to strengthen it, to make it not as susceptible to those types of vulnerabilities that it might have had in the past. Again, we see a look at the law enforcement spending versus drug treatment. And again, it's a lot more money is being spent on law enforcement than treatment and prevention. One of the things Nixon did for all of the bad stuff, he put more money into treatment programs than any other president in terms of proportion versus law enforcement spending. We see an extreme increase in law enforcement spending during the 1990s, and in a response to the drug markets and the increased violence during that brief period of time. The only thing that adjusted that, as you might see this massive drop off in the graph, happened around September of 2001. So we have those geopolitical issues come in terms of the war on terror that affects the spending on drugs. And it literally took that. It literally took a terrorist attack that destroyed 2 skyscrapers and an attack on the Pentagon for drug spending to be reduced. And it still never really, it never fell below what we're spending on drug treatment. We're always spending more on law enforcement, even though we know now, we knew then, that punishing our way out of this wasn't working. So the current political landscape, you can't be soft on crime and get elected, although that's sort of changing. We're starting to rethink what it means to be a criminal, what that label means. Should that be a master status, or should that be something that people can rebuild their lives from? And the answer is they should be able to, because most of the people that go to prison are going to come out. So we have to figure out some way to address the situation instead of just hoping for the best and trying to punish our way out of it, because that's not going to happen. There is still very little healthy debate among politicians, because at the top level, the people that are there and that are arguing for antiquated, xenophobic, racist, bigotous policies are there trying to keep their jobs. Again, I said this before, but there was a a satire raised about Mitch McConnell that said if he actually did vote for something that would benefit the people of Kentucky, the state that he is elected from, it would be by accident. The only thing he looks out for is maintaining his position, maintaining his personal wealth, um, and that's a major problem. We also saw that with the when the pandemic first started, there were several senators that were briefed and given information about the developing healthcare situation early, as is common with high-ranking government officials. They should know about those things before the general public. But instead of using that time to plan and make arrangements for their constituents, several senators used the opportunity to sell stock to avoid a potential drop in their net worth with respect to the global health situation. So again, these are just some of the ways that crime has impacted the way politicians act, the way they vote, and um, how that sort of impacts. We're gonna look at the next PowerPoint, looking at crime in the media, how those changes are interpreted and reported, and then how that affects our opinions. It's kind of looking at the feedback loop between uh, what the people say, what the people want, how politicians perceive that, how the media covers that interaction, and then how people view those framings and view those portrayals of what is being done and said to either um, evolve their opinion or to reinforce it.